In 1911, the United States government finally did what reformers had begged it to do for over 20 years. It took the most powerful monopoly on earth, Standard Oil, and it smashed it into 34 separate pieces. And within a year, the men who had owned it were richer than before. The stock of the broken fragments nearly doubled. Sit with that for a second. If the monopoly's power came from gouging you at the pump, then breaking it apart should have vaporized a fortune. Instead, it minted one. That single fact is the whole story. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why. So let me put you in the seat where it makes sense. It's the 1880s. You own a refinery, or a steel mill, or a stretch of railroad. Pick your poison. The trap is the same. And the trap is this: you cannot stop. Demand just fell, and your machine does not care. The furnace has to stay lit. The interest on the loan comes due whether you ship a single barrel or not. So you do the only thing a rational person can do. You cut your price to keep the orders coming, and then your rival cuts his. And here's the part they never tell you in the story about greedy monopolists. Nobody in this room is trying to raise prices. Everybody in this room is desperately, ruinously, trying to survive prices that will not stop falling. Here's what I want you to walk out of this knowing. Most industrial monopolies weren't built to raise prices. They were built to stop prices from falling. The trust is not the predator that won the jungle. It is usually the cartel that failed the last, most drastic thing a bleeding industry does when nothing gentler will work. We've been telling the story upside down. We look at the giant, and we assume the giant ate everyone because it was hungry. Most of the time, the giant formed because everyone was drowning, and merging was the only way to stop the water rising. I'm going to show you the exact mechanism. Not a moral, a mechanism, the actual machine, gear by gear. I'm going to show you why these industries were genuinely brilliant, why that brilliance turned into a knife pointed at their own throat, and why the smartest men of the age couldn't stop it even when they could see it happening. And I'm going to show you the one feature they all shared, the feature that made them mighty and doomed at the same time. Because once you see it, the word monopoly is never going to mean what you thought it meant. The fixed cost never sleeps. Hold on to that phrase. You'll need it. Now, before we take this machine apart, I need you to see how good it was. Because the lazy version of this story treats these industries as dumb brutes that got lucky. They weren't. They were, genuinely, some of the most elegant cost-cutting machines human beings have ever built. And if you had been standing where those men stood, you would have built exactly the same thing. Take the refinery. When Standard Oil got started, kerosene, the stuff that lit the American home after dark, cost about 26 cents a gallon. That was real money for a working family. The difference between reading after sundown and going to bed with the sun. Now watch what the machine did to that number. By 1880, the price was down to 9 cents. By 1890, closer to 7. In a single generation, the cost of light in an ordinary home fell by roughly 3/4. That is not villainy. That is one of the great deflationary miracles in the history of ordinary life. And it happened because the machine was obsessive about waste in a way nobody had been before. How obsessive? The refinery figured out how to make its kerosene using about 1/5 of the sulfuric acid its competitors burned through, and then it recovered and resold the acid instead of dumping it. It took the 40% of every barrel that rival refiners simply threw away as useless slop, and it turned that slop into paraffin, into lubricants, into wax, into the gasoline nobody yet wanted. Every scrap that used to run into the river became a product with a price on it. Multiply that discipline across every gallon, every plant, every year, and you get a cost structure no small refiner on earth could touch. And it didn't stop at the refinery walls. The machine reached backward and forward along the whole chain until it owned all of it, its own barrel works, its own pipelines snaking across the countryside, its own fleet of tank cars, its own buyers standing at the wellhead. Every link that used to be a middleman taking a slice became a link the machine owned, which meant a slice it kept. Steel did the same thing from the other direction. A man like Carnegie became famous for a single obsession driving down the cost of a steel rail, and he did it by swallowing everything upstream: the ore mines, the coke ovens, the ships and the little rail lines that carried it. so that raw ore flowed in one end of his empire and finished steel came out the other, with no outsider ever pricing a stage in between. Watch the cost of a steel rail fall across these decades and you see exactly what you saw with kerosene, a price sliding and sliding until steel that had once been precious became the thing you paved a continent with. Again, not villainy, genius. The kind of genius that quietly rewrites what an ordinary person can afford. The railroad had its own version of the miracle, and it's the one you have to understand in your bones, because it's the key to everything that follows. Once you have laid the track, bought the locomotives, and hired the crew, the cost of carrying one more ton of freight is almost nothing. The train is already running. The rails are already there. That last ton rides for pennies. This is the thing that built the modern world a national market, where wheat from Kansas could reach a table in New York for a price that would have been science fiction a generation earlier. So when you sit in that owner's chair, you are not a fool and you are not a crook. You are running the most productive machine your civilization has ever seen. Everything I am about to describe happens not despite that brilliance, but because of it. So let's follow one thing through the machine, because the abstraction only bites when it's concrete. Follow one train. It's a bad year, and in this era, most of them were. Freight is down. Your train is going to make its run half empty. Now, remember the miracle. The cost of putting one more ton into that empty car is almost nothing. The engine is already burning coal. The crew is already paid. The bridge is already bought. So here is the question that will destroy you. A shipper comes to you and says he'll give you his freight, but only if you drop your rate below what your rival is charging. Do you take it? Of course you take it. That extra ton is almost pure gain against a cost you've already paid. Turning it away is madness, so you cut. And your rival, staring at his own half-empty train, does the identical math and cuts deeper. And now you're in a rate war, and this actually happened, again and again. Most spectacularly, when Jay Gould started tearing up the Eastern rate agreements in the early 1880s, and the great lines slashed at each other until the freight moved for a fraction of what it had cost to move it the year before. Here's the trap in one line. When the cost of one more unit is nearly zero, the price two desperate rivals will accept for that unit also falls toward nearly zero. Your greatest strength, that miraculous near-free extra ton, becomes the rope you hang each other with. And these weren't polite little trims. When the great trunk lines went to war, the rate to haul a load between major cities could crater to a fraction of what it had been just months before, and at the worst moments, freight moved for so little that the railroads were effectively paying to carry it purely to deny the traffic to a rival. Picture that for a second. A 300-ton machine thundering across the country, hauling goods at a price that doesn't cover the coal in the firebox, not because anyone in the story is stupid, but because the only alternative, an empty car of your own beside a rival's full one, is somehow worse. You are not losing money by accident here. You are losing it on purpose, deliberately, with your eyes open, because it is the least bad option in front of you. That is what the trap feels like from the inside. And every man on every competing line is feeling the exact same thing at the exact same moment, and now stack the second weight on top of that. This entire drama is playing out inside the longest, grindingest deflation in modern industrial history. Between 1873 and 1896, American wholesale prices fell by roughly a third. Let that land. Not for a quarter, not for a bad year for more than 2 decades. The general price of things drifted downward, year after year after year. Now think about what that does to a man who borrowed money to build a plant. His debt is fixed in dollars. But every dollar is getting more valuable every year, which means his debt is quietly getting heavier every year, while the price of everything he sells keeps sliding out from under him. He is running up a down escalator, and the escalator never stops. And say it with me, the fixed cost never sleeps. So the industry does the same thing first. It tries to be civilized about it. This is the part of the story that gets skipped. And it's the most important part, because it's where you learn that these men were not idiots. They tried everything reasonable before they tried anything drastic. The reasonable thing is a pool. You get the heads of the rival railroads in a room, and you all shake hands and agree. We'll stop this insane price war. We'll each take an agreed slice of the traffic. We'll hold the rate at a level where everyone can breathe. On paper, it's perfect. It's a peace treaty, and it collapses every single time. Not sometimes as a rule. The pools of the 1870s and 1880s formed, and cracked, and reformed, and cracked again. And the men who ran them, serious men who wanted them to work, watched them fail over and over until the government finally outlawed the whole arrangement in 1887. Why do they always fail? Go back to your half-empty train. You've shaken hands. You've promised to hold your rate. And then a shipper quietly offers you a load, a big one if you'll shave a little off the agreed price, on the side where the others can't see. And that extra freight is almost pure profit against costs you've already paid. The temptation isn't a moral weakness. It's built into the arithmetic. The very structure that makes the price war inevitable also makes the peace treaty impossible, because the first man to cheat wins, and everyone knows it, so everyone does it, and the pool dissolves into exactly the war it was built to end. This is the cost that never shows up on any ledger. Not the price of a barrel, the price of the war itself. The duplicated sales forces, 3 of them calling on the same customer. The parallel rail lines laid beside each other into towns that needed one. The plants running below capacity, because no one dares be the one to blink. Years, sometimes decades, of an entire industry's energy poured into cutting its own throat and its rivals at the same time. That is the real bill. And a handshake, it turns out, cannot pay it. The fixed cost never sleeps, and a promise cannot make it sleep. The men who ran these pools were not naive, either. The railroads found their great organizer in Albert Fink, a gifted engineer who built elaborate associations with formulas for dividing up the traffic, boards to arbitrate the disputes, whole small bureaucracies devoted to holding the peace. He was, by every account, a serious and capable man. And he spent his later years watching his own creations fail, until he was reduced to pleading with the government to make pooling legal, in the hope that the law might enforce what a handshake never could. It couldn't, and it didn't. But watch what the whole industry is reaching for, almost against its own will. If a contract between separate owners always breaks, then the answer is to stop being separate owners. That is precisely the logic that produced the trust in the first place. Standard Oil's lawyers built the original trust in 1882 as a legal contraption to bind dozens of nominally independent companies under a single hand. The sugar refiners followed it. The whiskey men followed it. Each one was a pool that had finally admitted a pool would never be enough. Now, the honest thing to admit here is that a handshake is not the only tool people reached for. Some pools tried to get teeth penalties, umpires, deposits held in escrow. Some industries had a strong player who could bully the others into line for a while, and those did buy time, sometimes years of it. But notice what getting teeth is actually reaching toward. Every reinforcement to the agreement is an attempt to make betrayal more costly to bind the members tighter, until cheating simply isn't possible anymore. Follow that logic all the way to its end, and you don't arrive at a better handshake. You arrive at the only agreement that can't be broken. Hold that thought. We're almost there. Because now, the ground shifts. There is one variable this whole system was never built to survive, and it isn't a villain, and it isn't bad luck. It's the deflation itself, that quarter century of falling prices, but it's worth being precise about what it actually did, because this is the hinge of the entire story. The deflation did not create the trap. The trap was always there, wired into the machine from the day it was built. The fixed cost that runs whether you sell or not. The near-free extra unit that begs to be sold at any price. In a world of stable or gently rising prices, an industry can live with that trap. Demand grows a little each year. The extra capacity gets absorbed. The rate war stays a skirmish. What the long deflation did was strip that cushion away. When prices fall year after year, every plant is desperate at the same time. Every train is half empty at the same time. Every man in the pool is looking at the same closing walls, so every man cheats at once. And no handshake on earth can hold. Deflation didn't invent the disease. It removed the last thing keeping the disease from being fatal. It took a structural weakness the industry had carried for decades and turned the lights on so you could finally see it. And it's worth understanding why the prices kept falling for so long, because this wasn't a slump in the ordinary sense. Output was actually growing the entire time. The world ran on a gold standard, and the supply of gold simply could not keep pace with how fast these new machines were pumping goods into existence. More and more product chasing a slowly growing pile of money means each unit of money buys a little more every year, which is just another way of saying prices fall, not for a season, but structurally, for a generation. So this was never weather you could wait out. It was climate. A refiner or a railroad man in 1885 had no reason on earth to believe next year would be gentler than this one, because for as far back as he could remember, it never once had been. The escalator had been descending under his feet for his entire working life, and nothing on the horizon suggested it would stop. And that raises the question this whole thing has been circling. Why couldn't these industries just absorb a hard stretch the way other businesses did? A shopkeeper in a bad year lays off a clerk, orders less stock, waits it out. Why couldn't the mighty refinery, the mighty railroad, just make less and ride it out? Hold that question, because the answer is the entire point, and it's coming now. Here is the flip. Here is the thing that turns the whole villain story inside out. The thing that made these industries powerful is the exact same thing that made them impossible to save. Not two flaws. One feature, seen from two sides of a falling market. Watch it happen with a single sentence, and then I'll prove it to you. What made you mighty was that your cost of making one more unit was almost nothing. That's how you flooded the country with cheap light and cheap freight, and buried every small competitor who couldn't match your price. And what killed you was that your cost of making one more unit was almost nothing, because that means the price two desperate rivals will accept also falls toward nothing, and you can never, ever stop producing to hold it up. Because the fixed cost runs whether you produce or not. The strength and the wound are the same organ. Read from left to right, it's a miracle. Read from right to left, it's a death sentence. Same sentence. And that is why just make less was never available to you. The shopkeeper can make less because his costs shrink when he does fewer clerks, less stock. But your costs don't shrink. The track is still there. The interest is still due. The blast furnace cracks if you let it go cold. Idling your plant doesn't save you money. It just means you're paying the enormous fixed cost and earning nothing against it. So you can't cut production to defend the price. Your only move is to keep running flat out and cut the price instead, which is the very thing dragging you under. The efficiency that was supposed to be your salvation has removed your only escape hatch. So sit in that chair one last time and ask what's actually left. You can't hold the price by making less, the machine won't let you. You can't hold it by agreement, the handshake always breaks. There is exactly one way left to stop the men around you from cutting the price. You stop them from being separate men at all. You buy them. You merge every rival into a single owner, so that cutting the price against yourself becomes not a broken promise, but a physical impossibility. The trust is the pool that finally got teeth, the only version that can't be cheated, because there's no longer anyone on the other side to cheat. This is the law underneath all of it, and I'll say it plainly. An efficiency you cannot switch off will compete you to death, and once it does, the only way left to survive it is to own everyone who shares it. That is the machine. The fixed cost never sleeps, so in the end, the machine had to swallow every other machine just to make the cutting stop. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the fact that should have been impossible. 1,911. The government breaks Standard Oil into 34 pieces, and the owners get richer. The fragments, set loose, are together worth roughly double inside a year. John D. Rockefeller, who held better than a quarter of the whole thing, watches his fortune swell until by 1913 he is worth something near $900 million, the first billionaire the world had made. Now, if the trust's power had really come from gouging the public with high prices, breaking it should have destroyed that value. Smash the predator, free the prey, the fortune evaporates. Instead, the fortune grew. There is only one explanation that fits, and it's the one this whole story has been building toward. Most of the trust's profit never came from charging you more. It came from the thing it ended, the war. It came from firing the two redundant sales teams calling on the same grocer, from shutting the duplicate plants, from stopping the rate wars that had burned money for decades. The value was in the peace, not in the gouging. When you broke the trust apart, you didn't free a captive market from a tyrant, you handed its shareholders a set of lean, war-tested companies in a growing industry, and the market repriced them for exactly what they were worth. The same thing happened that very year to the American Tobacco Company, dissolved into 16 successors under the same law. Break the giant, and the pieces thrive. That's not the signature of a predator being slain. It's the signature of an industry that had been consolidated for a reason. And notice what the market was actually pricing when it doubled the value of those fragments. It wasn't betting that the little companies would gouge the public harder than the big one had. It was pricing lean, war-tested operators turned loose in an industry that was still growing companies that had already done the brutal work of killing the duplication and ending the rate wars, now free to chase new markets without a lumbering parent holding them back. The cruelty and the clarity of it are the same thing. The government believed it was liberating a captive public, and in a real sense, it did nothing of the kind. It simply confirmed, in hard dollars, that the value had never really been in the gouging at all. And if you want the reason written even more plainly, look at the giant that was built at the very top of the wave. In 1901, J.P. Morgan assembled United States Steel, capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, a company that, at its height, made 2/3 of the nation's steel. The largest company the world had ever seen, born full-grown in a single afternoon of financial engineering. And here is the thing nobody puts on the poster. Almost from the day it was born, it began to lose. Its share of American steel slid from around 2/3 toward 1/2 within the decade, and kept sliding for decades after. The nimble, smaller firms it had not swallowed the Bethlehems. The inlands grew faster and innovated harder than the Colossus. The biggest company on earth turned out to be slower than the minnows it had failed to eat. And this is the pattern sitting under all of them, once you know to look for it. The sugar trust, the whiskey trust, the giants of oil and steel and rail over and over. The combination formed not at the triumphant peak of a boom, but in the teeth of a price collapse. And over, once the war it had ended was over, the giant proved strangely unable to defend its own size. Shielded from the very competition that had forged it, the trust slowed down. It innovated less than the hungry outsiders nipping at it. Its own success at ending the war had removed the pressure that once kept it sharp. The monopoly, it turns out, was often at its most powerful the very day it was born and began dying the morning after. So then why didn't anyone stop this? Not the government, not the reformers, not the brilliant men running the machines who could plainly see the walls closing in. Because, and this is the part I need you to really hear, there were no idiots in this story. That's the whole point. Every single move was rational for the man who made it. The shipper who took the secret discount was right to take it. The railroad that cheated the pool was right to cheat. The first cheater wins. And refusing just means you lose while someone else wins. The owner who cut his price to fill the empty train was right. Turning away near-free freight really is madness. And the men who finally merged were right too. It was the only move left that actually worked. Each rational decision, added to the next, marched the whole industry straight to the trust. That's the cruelty of it. You don't need a villain to build a monopoly. You just need a fixed cost that never sleeps and a lot of intelligent people each doing the sensible thing. You can watch this play out one last time in the most civilized disguise the age ever produced. When the head of U.S. Steel wanted to hold prices steady across the whole industry, he didn't start a rate war and he didn't sign an illegal pool. He hosted dinners. Between 1907 and 1911, Elbert Gary gathered the men who ran the steel companies around a table for a series of famous, friendly meals, and over the wine he preached cooperation instead of competition. Everyone hold your prices. Everyone behave. Nobody has to cut. It was the pool reincarnated as a gentleman's supper club, an attempt to enforce with manners and reputation what could never be enforced with a contract. And it, too, was a confession. The single most powerful man in the largest industry on earth had been reduced to asking his rivals, over dinner, to please stop competing because he understood, better than anyone alive, that the machine left to itself would drag every one of them straight back down toward the floor. Even the law got caught in it. The Sherman Act arrived in 1890 to stop exactly this kind of combination, and it arrived at the precise moment. The combination was the only thing keeping a deflation-battered industry off the floor. And when the government finally dragged U.S. Steel into court, the case fell apart in a way that gives the whole game away. In 1920, by a single vote, the Supreme Court let the company walk not because it decided monopoly was fine, but because U.S. Steel had so obviously stopped being one. Competition had come roaring back. The rivals had caught up. The court spared the giant precisely because the giant had already failed at being a giant. Read that twice. The monopoly was declared harmless because it had lost. So let me hand you the law with all the names and dates stripped off, because that's the test of whether it's really a law. It should still be true when there's no oil and no steel and no 1,873 anywhere in it. Here it is. Any industry where the cost of making one more unit is close to nothing, and the cost of simply existing is enormous, will drive its own price toward the floor, and then, unable to stop that any other way, it will consolidate to survive. Not out of greed, out of arithmetic. The monopoly is not the disease. It's the scar tissue the industry grows over a wound it inflicted on itself by being too efficient to stop. And I don't need to tell you where to look for that shape today. I just need to describe it, and you'll find it yourself. Look for an industry that costs a staggering fortune to build and almost nothing to run for one more customer. Where the second copy, the second stream, the next user, rides for pennies against a mountain of fixed cost that was paid up front and never sleeps. Wherever you find that shape, you will find the same drama trying to play out the same brutal price competition, the same desperate reach for scale, the same handful of survivors at the end. The names change. The arithmetic doesn't. You already live surrounded by that shape, whether or not anyone has ever named it for you. Think of any business that pours a fortune into building a thing once and then serves each additional customer for almost nothing at all. The pattern in this story is not a museum piece behind glass. It's a template, still being stamped out today, and the reason a mere handful of enormous firms keep rising up in exactly those industries, again and again, generation after generation, is not that their founders happen to be greedier than everyone else. It's that they are standing on the very same trapdoor the refiners and the railroad men stood on a century ago, and there is still only one way off it. The math is brutal, and the men caught in it were not fools. You have to hold both of those at once to see this clearly. They built machines so efficient that the machines turned on them, and then they did the only thing left to do. Which is the sentence I want to leave you with, the one that took an entire industry and a generation of very smart men to write. Monopoly is what an industry builds when it can no longer survive its own efficiency. Same law, different machine. Next time, the cost of one more unit isn't near zero, it is zero, exactly and perfectly zero. And the thing it floods the world with isn't oil, or steel, or freight, it's you.